Sarah Martinez stood outside the Army recruitment office on a hot Tuesday morning in Phoenix, Arizona. Her hands were shaking as she held the glass door handle. She had been walking past this building for 3 weeks, trying to find the courage to go inside. Today was different. Today she was finally going to do it. At 22 years old, Sarah looked like she belonged in a library, not a military base. She was barely 5 feet tall and weighed less than most high school boys. Her long black hair was always pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she wore simple clothes that made her look even younger than she was. When people saw her, they thought of teachers or nurses, not soldiers. Sarah had grown up in a quiet neighborhood where the biggest excitement was the ice cream truck coming around on summer evenings. Her parents owned a small flower shop, and she had spent her childhood helping them arrange bouquets and water plants. Her grandmother lived with them, and Sarah spent most of her free time reading books to her or helping her with crossword puzzles. After high school, Sarah got a job at Barnes & Noble bookstore in the mall. She loved being surrounded by books all day. Her coworkers liked her because she was always willing to help customers find exactly what they were looking for. She had a gentle way of talking that made people feel comfortable. During her lunch breaks, she would sit in the back room reading adventure novels about brave heroes who saved the day. But something had changed in Sarah over the past year. Every night she watched the news about the wars happening far away. She saw stories about soldiers fighting in dangerous places, and she saw pictures of people who needed help. Something deep inside her heart kept telling her that she should do something important with her life. She should help people who really needed it. The problem was that nobody thought Sarah could be a soldier. When she first mentioned the idea to her parents, her mother almost choked on her coffee. Her father just stared at her like she had said she wanted to become a professional wrestler. Even her best friend from high school laughed and said she was too nice to be in the military. Sarah tried to ignore these voices, but they made her doubt herself. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe she was too small, too quiet, too gentle for military life. She had never been in a fight. She had never even raised her voice at anyone. How could someone like her survive in the army? But the feeling inside her would not go away. Every morning when she woke up, she thought about the soldiers on TV who were helping people in dangerous places. Every night before she went to sleep, she wondered if she was brave enough to do something that mattered. The war news made her feel like she was sitting safely at home while other people were sacrificing everything to protect freedom and help others. So here she was, standing outside the recruitment office, trying to work up the nerve to walk inside. Through the glass window, she could see posters of strong-looking men and women in military uniforms. They all looked confident and tough. They looked like they belonged in the army. Sarah looked at her reflection in the glass and wondered if she was making a huge mistake. The door opened and a tall man in uniform came out. He was probably in his 30s with short brown hair and serious eyes. When he saw Sarah standing there, he stopped and looked at her curiously. Sergeant First. Class Mike Thompson had been a recruiter for 5 years. He had talked to hundreds of young people who wanted to join the Army. Most of them were big athletic guys who played football or worked construction jobs. Some were tough young women who had grown up in rough neighborhoods. He could usually tell within 5 minutes who would make it through basic training and who would quit. Looking at Sarah, his first thought was that she was probably lost. Maybe she was looking for the college counseling office or the job placement center. She definitely did not look like someone who wanted to be a soldier. "Are you looking for something?" he asked in a kind voice. Sarah took a deep breath. She had practiced this moment in her head 100 times, but now that it was actually happening, her mouth felt dry and her heart was beating fast. "I want to join the Army," she said quietly. Sergeant Thompson tried not to show his surprise. He had heard this before from people who looked like they would never survive military life. Usually he would spend a few minutes talking to them and they would realize the military was not for them. But something about the way Sarah said it made him take a second look. "Are you sure about that?" he asked. "Do you know what the Army is really like?" Sarah nodded. "I have been thinking about it for a long time. I know it will be hard, but I want to serve my country. I want to help people." Sergeant Thompson studied her face. She seemed sincere, but she also seemed like a strong breeze could knock her over. He had seen tough-looking guys quit basic training after just a few days. How could someone like this possibly make it through? "Why do not you come inside and we can talk about it," he said. "But I have to be honest with you. The military is not easy. It is physically demanding and mentally challenging. Are you prepared for that?" Sarah followed him into the office. The walls were covered with pictures of soldiers in action and motivational posters about strength and courage. Everything in the room seemed designed to make people feel small and intimidated. Sarah felt very out of place, but she sat down in the chair across from Sergeant Thompson's desk and tried to look confident. For the next hour, Sergeant Thompson explained what military life was really like. He talked about the physical training, the long hours, the time away from family, and the possibility of being sent to dangerous places. He watched Sarah's face carefully, expecting to see doubt or fear creep in. Most people who were not cut out for military life would start making excuses and looking for the door about halfway through his speech. But Sarah listened to every word without flinching. When he described the hardest parts of basic training, she nodded and asked practical questions. When he talked about deployments to combat zones, she asked about the medical training soldiers received. She was not trying to get out of anything. She was trying to understand what she was getting into. By the end of their conversation, Sergeant Thompson was genuinely puzzled. Sarah still looked like she belonged in a bookstore, but she had not backed down from anything he had told her. She seemed determined to join, even though he had made it clear how difficult it would be. "I need to ask," he said. "Are you sure you are physically ready for this? Basic training is going to push you harder than you have ever been pushed before." Sarah looked him straight in the eye. "I know I do not look strong, but I will not quit. I will do whatever it takes." Something about the way she said it made Sergeant Thompson believe her. Against his better judgment, he found himself reaching for the enlistment paperwork. Maybe he was making a mistake, but there was something special about this quiet young woman who was so determined to serve her country. 3 months later, Sarah found herself standing in line at Fort Benning, Georgia, with 60 other new recruits. The bus ride from the airport had been quiet and tense. Everyone seemed nervous about what was coming next. Sarah looked around at her fellow trainees and felt like she had made a terrible mistake. Most of the men were huge. There was Jake from Texas, who had played college football and looked like he could lift a car. Marcus from Detroit had arms covered in tattoos and muscles that strained against his t-shirt. Even the women looked tough and athletic. Jennifer from California had been a personal trainer, and Amy from New York had boxed in high school. Then there was Sarah, standing barely 5 feet tall in her new Army t-shirt that was too big for her small frame. She had tried to prepare herself physically over the summer. She jogged every morning around her neighborhood and did push-ups in her bedroom. But looking at these other recruits, she realized her preparation had not been nearly enough. The drill sergeants appeared like storms rolling in. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was a mountain of a man with a voice that could shake windows. Sergeant First Class Williams was shorter, but looked like she could run through a brick wall. They began yelling instructions immediately, and Sarah felt her heart racing as she tried to keep up with everything they were saying. The first few days were brutal. Sarah struggled with everything. During the morning physical training, she finished last in every run. When they did push-ups, she could barely manage 10 while others were doing 50. During obstacle course training, she needed help getting over walls that other recruits climbed easily. The other trainees began to notice. During meal times, she could hear whispers and see pointing. Some of the guys started making jokes about the tiny recruit who looked like she should be working in a daycare center instead of training to be a soldier. A few of the women tried to be encouraging, but Sarah could tell they also had doubts about whether she belonged there. Master Sergeant Rodriguez watched everything with sharp eyes. He had been training soldiers for 15 years, and he could usually predict who would make it and who would wash out within the first week. Sarah was clearly struggling physically, but something about her caught his attention. While other recruits complained about the food, the early wake-up calls, and the harsh treatment, Sarah never said a word of complaint. The turning point came during the 3rd week of training. The recruits were doing a night navigation exercise in the woods around Fort Benning. They were divided into small groups and given maps and compasses. The goal was to find several checkpoints in the dark and make it back to base before dawn. Sarah, was grouped with Jake, Marcus, and Jennifer. The three of them immediately took charge, confident in their abilities to read the map and navigate through the forest. Sarah quietly followed behind, carrying her share of the equipment and saying, "Little." Everything went wrong from the beginning. Jake was sure he knew which direction to go, but after an hour of walking, they were completely lost. Marcus insisted they should head west, while Jennifer was certain they needed to go north. As the hours passed and they could not find any of the checkpoints, frustration began to build. Jake started blaming the map. Marcus said the compasses were broken. Jennifer accused the drill sergeants of giving them impossible directions. Meanwhile, other groups were radioing in that they had found their checkpoints and were heading back to base. Sarah had been quiet through all of this, but she had also been paying attention, while the others argued she had been studying the map carefully and watching the stars. She had learned navigation skills during camping trips with her grandfather when she was younger. He had taught her how to read the land and use natural markers to find her way. Finally, as dawn was approaching and the group was becoming desperate, Sarah spoke up quietly. "I think I know where we are," she said. The others turned to look at her, with surprise. Jake laughed and said they should probably listen to someone who actually knew what they were doing, but Sarah was not intimidated. She pointed to a hill in the distance and explained that according to the map, there should be a creek running behind it. If they followed that creek south for about a mile, they would find the main trail that would lead them back to base. Marcus shook his head and said they should keep trying his way, but Jennifer was getting worried about the time and said they should give Sarah a chance. The group reluctantly followed Sarah as she led them toward the hill. Within 30 minutes, they found the creek exactly where she said it would be. Following it south, they discovered the main trail and then found two of the checkpoints they had been looking for all night. They made it back to base, just as the sun was rising. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was waiting for them with a stern expression. Most of the other groups had returned hours earlier, and he was not happy that this group was so late. But when he asked for a report, Jake surprised everyone by telling the truth. He explained that they had gotten lost, and that Sarah had been the one to figure out where they were and guide them home. He admitted that without her navigation skills, they probably would still be wandering around in the woods. Master Sergeant Rodriguez looked at Sarah with new interest. Over the following weeks, he began to notice other things about the quiet recruit from Arizona. During weapons training, her small size and steady hands made her an excellent marksman. She could hit targets that gave bigger, stronger recruits trouble. More importantly, Sarah had qualities that could not be taught. When other recruits were struggling with homesickness or doubt, Sarah was always there to listen and offer encouragement. She shared her care packages from home without being asked. She volunteered for extra cleaning duties when others were too tired. She also had incredible mental toughness. No matter how difficult the training became, Sarah never complained and never gave up. When they did 20-mile marches carrying full packs, Sarah might finish last, but she always finished. When they did combat drills in the mud and rain, Sarah kept going when others wanted to quit. The other recruits began to see Sarah differently too. They realized that while she might be small, she was also incredibly reliable. If Sarah was in your group, you knew she would do her part and never let you down. Her quiet determination inspired others to push harder and complain less. By the end of basic training, Sarah had earned something more valuable than physical strength. She had earned respect. After completing basic training and advanced medical training, Sarah received orders for her first deployment to Afghanistan in March 2004. She was now a certified combat medic, trained to save lives on the battlefield. The flight from Fort Bragg to Kandahar Air Base took 18 hours, giving Sarah plenty of time to think about what lay ahead. Sarah had chosen to become a medic because she wanted to help people, not hurt them. During her medical training, she had discovered she had natural, healing instincts. Her instructors praised her ability to stay calm under pressure and her gentle touch with patients. She could start an IV on her first try when other students needed multiple attempts. When Sarah arrived at Forward Operating Base Chapman in eastern Afghanistan, she was assigned to Alpha Company, 3rd Battalion. The base was surrounded by mountains and desert, and the heat during the day was overwhelming. Everything was brown and dusty, very different from the green landscape of Georgia where she had trained. Captain Mills, her company commander, looked at Sarah with the same doubt she had seen many times before. He was a career soldier who had served in the First Gulf War, and he was not sure what to make of the tiny medic who looked like she should be working in a hospital instead of a war zone. The other soldiers in her unit were also skeptical at first. There was Sergeant First Class Peterson, a big man from Montana who had been in the Army for 12 years. Corporal Davis was a tough guy from Chicago who had joined the Army to escape gang violence in his neighborhood. Private First Class Thompson was only 19 but had grown up hunting and fishing in rural Alabama. Sarah spent her first month at the base learning the routines and getting to know her fellow soldiers. She treated minor injuries and illnesses, helped with supply runs, and participated in training exercises. The work was not too different from what she had done in medical school, except for the constant threat of enemy attacks. The base received mortar and rocket attacks almost every week. When the alarm sounded, everyone had to run to bunkers and wait for the all clear. Sarah noticed that she was not as scared as she thought she would be. Instead of panicking, she found herself thinking about what medical supplies she would need, if anyone got hurt. Her first real test came on a hot morning in July. Alpha Company was conducting a routine patrol through a nearby village when their convoy hit an improvised explosive device. Sarah was riding in the third vehicle when the explosion threw the lead truck into a drainage ditch. The blast was enormous. Sarah felt her vehicle shake violently, and her ears started ringing from the noise. Dust and smoke filled the air, making it hard to see or breathe. For a moment, everything was quiet except for the sound of metal settling and engines hissing. Then the screaming started. Sarah grabbed her medical bag and jumped out of her vehicle before anyone could stop her. The lead truck was upside down, and she could see soldiers trapped inside. Sergeant First Class Peterson was unconscious and bleeding from a head wound. Corporal Davis was awake, but his leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. Private First Class Thompson was crying for help, pinned under part of the vehicle. Sarah ran toward the overturned truck, ignoring the possibility that there might be more explosives nearby. Her training kicked in automatically. She assessed each patient quickly, deciding who needed help most urgently. Peterson was bleeding badly from his head and needed immediate attention to prevent him from dying. Working under the overturned vehicle was dangerous and cramped, but Sarah's small size was finally an advantage. She could crawl into spaces where larger soldiers could not fit. She applied pressure to Peterson's head wound while simultaneously checking his breathing and pulse. While she worked on Peterson, enemy fighters began shooting at the convoy from buildings in the village. Bullets were hitting the ground around Sarah, but she continued treating her patients. She had tunnel vision, focused completely on keeping her fellow soldiers alive. Captain Mills was amazed by what he saw. The quiet little medic who had seemed so out of place was now working calmly in the middle of a firefight. She moved between the injured soldiers, treating their wounds and reassuring them that everything would be okay. Sarah worked for 4 hours straight, while the battle raged around her. She stabilized Peterson's head injury, set Davis' broken leg, and freed Thompson from under the vehicle. When helicopters finally arrived to evacuate the wounded, all 3 soldiers were alive because of her quick thinking and skilled medical care. During the evacuation, Sarah was also injured. Flying glass from the explosion had cut her arms and face, and she had suffered a concussion from the blast. But she had been so focused on helping others that she had not even noticed her own wounds until someone pointed them out. For her actions, that day Sarah received her first Purple Heart for being wounded in combat and a Bronze Star for exceptional bravery. But when the medals were presented, Sarah barely paid attention to the ceremony. She was more interested in visiting Peterson, Davis, and Thompson in the military hospital to make sure they were recovering well. Word of Sarah's heroic actions spread quickly throughout the base and beyond. Other units began requesting her specifically for dangerous missions. The soldiers who had once doubted whether she belonged in the Army now felt honored to serve alongside her. Sarah's second Purple Heart came just 3 months later during a fierce battle at a remote outpost. Her unit was attacked by more than 50 enemy fighters using rockets and mortars. During the 6-hour fight, Sarah moved between defensive positions, treating wounded soldiers while bullets flew overhead. A piece of shrapnel from a mortar round hit her in the leg, but she refused to be evacuated until the battle was over and all other wounded had been treated. She continued working with blood soaking through her uniform, saving the lives of 5 more soldiers that day. By the end of her first deployment, Sarah had become a legend among the soldiers serving in Afghanistan. The tiny medic who had once looked so out of place was now someone everyone wanted on their team when the fighting got tough. Sarah returned home from her first deployment in early 2005 with 2 Purple Hearts and a reputation as one of the finest combat medics in the Army. She spent 6 months at Fort Bragg training new medics and recovering from her injuries. But when the opportunity came to deploy again, Sarah volunteered immediately. Her second deployment in 2006 took her to Iraq, where the fighting was even more intense than Afghanistan. Sarah was now a sergeant and was assigned to train newer medics while still serving on the front lines. The war had changed since her first deployment, with more sophisticated enemy tactics and higher casualty rates. Sarah was stationed at Camp Liberty near Baghdad International Airport. The base was constantly under attack from mortars, rockets, and suicide bombers. The enemy had learned to target medical personnel specifically, knowing that killing or wounding medics would hurt military morale and effectiveness. Despite the increased danger, Sarah threw herself into her work with the same dedication she had shown in Afghanistan. She trained dozens of new medics, teaching them not just medical techniques but also how to stay calm under fire. Her students looked up to her as a hero, someone who had proven herself in combat multiple times. The fighting in Iraq was different from Afghanistan in many ways. The enemy was better organized and had access to more advanced weapons. They used car bombs, suicide attacks, and sophisticated improvised explosive devices. The civilian population was caught in the middle, making it harder to tell who was friendly and who might be a threat. Sarah's 3rd Purple Heart came during an ambush that lasted 14 hours. Her convoy was transporting medical supplies to a forward operating base when they were attacked by more than 100 enemy fighters. The attack was carefully planned, with the enemy blocking escape routes and using heavy weapons to pin down the convoy. Sarah's vehicle was hit by a rocket-propelled grenade early in the fight. The explosion threw her against the side of the truck, bruising her ribs and giving her another concussion. But when she saw wounded soldiers scattered around the convoy, she ignored her own injuries and began moving between vehicles to treat casualties. The fighting was the most intense Sarah had ever experienced. Enemy snipers were targeting anyone who moved, and mortar rounds were exploding all around the convoy. Sarah used her small size to crawl between vehicles, staying low to avoid sniper fire while she worked on wounded soldiers. During the battle, Sarah noticed something that amazed the other soldiers. She seemed to have a 6th sense about where the enemy was hiding. She could spot sniper positions that experienced infantry soldiers missed. Her sharp eyes and attention to detail made her valuable not just as a medic, but as a tactical asset. Sarah treated 12 wounded soldiers during that long day of fighting. She performed emergency surgery on 2 soldiers who would have died without immediate medical intervention. A sniper bullet grazed her shoulder during the fight, earning her the 3rd Purple Heart. But she continued working until reinforcements arrived and the battle was over. After that battle, Sarah's reputation spread beyond just medical units. Infantry commanders began requesting her for the most dangerous missions, not just because of her medical skills, but because of her ability to spot enemy positions and her calming effect on other soldiers under fire. Her 4th Purple Heart came 6 months later during what should have been a routine supply convoy. Sarah was riding with a convoy of trucks carrying food and ammunition to troops in a dangerous area of Baghdad. The enemy had planted a series of explosives along the route and coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Sarah's vehicle was hit by the largest explosion she had ever experienced. The truck flipped completely over and caught fire. Sarah was trapped inside with broken ribs and internal bleeding. The other soldiers in her truck were hurt even worse, with one unconscious and the other unable to move his legs. Despite her serious injuries and the fact that the truck was filling with smoke, Sarah managed to free herself and then help the other 2 soldiers escape before the vehicle exploded completely. She then spent the next several hours treating not only soldiers from her own convoy, but also enemy fighters who had been wounded in the attack. This decision to treat enemy wounded, even while seriously injured herself, created controversy among some soldiers. A few questioned whether Sarah was being too soft on the enemy, but her commanding officers supported her decision, recognizing that treating enemy wounded was not just the right thing to do, but also good military strategy that could lead to valuable intelligence. Sarah's approach to treating enemy wounded came from her deep belief that all human life was valuable. She had joined the army to help people, and that meant helping anyone who needed medical attention, regardless of which side they were fighting for. This compassion made her respected not just by American soldiers, but also by many Iraqi civilians, who saw her as someone who truly cared about reducing suffering. The fourth Purple Heart ceremony was attended by high-ranking officers from across Iraq. General Morrison, who commanded all medical units in the country, personally presented Sarah with the medal and told her that she represented the best values of the American military. But Sarah was more interested in the letters she received from the families of soldiers she had saved. Each letter meant more to her than any medal or recognition from military leadership. She kept every letter in a box under her bunk, reading them when she felt discouraged or homesick. By the end of her second deployment, Sarah had saved more than 50 lives and trained over 100 new medics. She had become something of a legend throughout the entire Iraq theater of operations. New soldiers arriving in country had heard stories about the small sergeant, who seemed to appear wherever the fighting was heaviest. Some soldiers called her Saint Sarah because of her dedication to helping others. Others called her the Angel of Baghdad because she seemed to have divine protection during firefights. Sarah just called herself a soldier doing her job, but everyone who served with her knew she was something special. Sarah's third and final deployment began in 2008, when she returned to Afghanistan as a staff sergeant. The war had evolved again, with new enemy tactics and more sophisticated weapons. Sarah was now one of the most experienced combat medics in the entire army, and younger soldiers looked up to her as a mentor and hero. She was assigned to a special operations unit that conducted high-risk missions deep in enemy territory. These were dangerous assignments that required the most skilled and experienced soldiers. Sarah's reputation had grown so much that the unit commander specifically requested her, knowing that her medical skills and combat experience could mean the difference between success and failure. The soldiers in Sarah's new unit were all veterans of multiple deployments. There was Master Sergeant Williams, a career soldier from Texas who had been fighting in Afghanistan for 6 years. Sergeant First Class Johnson was a former Navy SEAL who had joined the Army for more combat opportunities. Staff Sergeant Martinez was a decorated infantry soldier who had earned 3 Bronze Stars. Even among these elite soldiers, Sarah stood out for her courage and dedication. She had developed an almost supernatural ability to stay calm during the worst situations. While other soldiers might panic or freeze during intense firefights, Sarah seemed to become more focused and effective as the danger increased. Her final Purple Heart came during what would be her last combat mission in December 2008. Intelligence reports had located a high-value enemy leader who was responsible for planning attacks against American forces. Sarah's unit was part of a joint operation involving Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, and Air Force Special Operations. The mission was supposed to be a quick in-and-out operation. They would land by helicopter, capture or kill the target, and be extracted before enemy reinforcements could arrive. But like so many military operations, everything went wrong from the very beginning. The helicopters were spotted by enemy lookouts before they could land. When Sarah's unit reached the target building, they found it was heavily defended by more than 200 enemy fighters. Instead of finding one high-value target, they had walked into a trap designed to kill as many American soldiers as possible. 3. Battle that followed was the most intense fighting Sarah had experienced in 4 deployments. Enemy fighters surrounded the building where her unit had taken cover, using rocket-propelled grenades, mortars, and heavy machine guns to try to kill everyone inside. During the first hour of fighting, half of Sarah's unit was wounded. Master Sergeant Williams was hit by shrapnel from a mortar round. Sergeant First Class Johnson was shot in the chest by a sniper. Staff Sergeant Martinez had his leg nearly blown off by a rocket-propelled grenade. Sarah found herself cut off from The main group with two badly wounded soldiers, Private First Class Davis and Corporal Thompson. Both men had serious injuries that required immediate medical attention, but they were pinned down in a small room with enemy fighters trying to break down the door. For 12 hours, Sarah held that position by herself. She used her rifle to fight off enemy attacks while simultaneously treating the wounded soldiers. Davis had been shot in the stomach and was losing blood rapidly. Thompson had taken shrapnel to his chest and was having trouble breathing. Sarah performed emergency surgery on both men using only the medical supplies in her aid bag. She had to remove shrapnel from Thompson's chest and repair damage to Davis' internal organs. All of this while enemy fighters were literally trying to break down the door to kill them all. Around hour 10 of the battle, an enemy explosive device detonated just outside their room. The blast sent metal fragments through the wall, hitting Sarah in the back and arm. The pain was incredible and she could feel blood running down her back. But she continued treating her patients and fighting off enemy attacks. Sarah knew that if she lost consciousness or gave up, all three of them would die. So she forced herself to stay awake and keep fighting. She talked to Davis and Thompson constantly, keeping them alert and focused on surviving until help could arrive. When rescue forces finally reached their position, they found an incredible scene. Sarah was unconscious from blood loss but was still lying across the two wounded soldiers, protecting them with her own body. Her rifle was empty, and there were dead enemy fighters just outside the door. Davis and Thompson both survived because of Sarah's actions during those 12 hours. Military investigators later determined that she had single-handedly fought off more than 30 enemy fighters while performing life-saving medical procedures on two critically wounded soldiers. For this final act of heroism, Sarah received not just her 5th Purple Heart but also the Silver Star, one of the highest medals the military can award for valor in combat. The ceremony was attended by the Secretary of Defense and was covered by news media around the world. But the injuries from that last battle ended Sarah's combat career. She had suffered permanent damage to her back and arm, and doctors determined that she could no longer serve in combat roles. After 8 years of military service, Sarah was medically retired from the Army at the age of 30. The transition to civilian life was difficult for Sarah. She had spent her entire adult life as a soldier, and suddenly she was just another civilian trying to find her place in the world. The physical injuries were painful, but the emotional adjustment was even harder. Sarah decided to return to her hometown of Phoenix, where she used her military medical training and veteran benefits to open a small clinic in a low-income neighborhood. Many of her patients were veterans who could not afford expensive medical care, and Sarah treated them for free whenever necessary. The 5 Purple Hearts, Bronze Star, and Silver Star hung quietly on the wall of her clinic office. Most patients never asked about them, and Sarah rarely talked about her military service. She preferred to focus on helping people in the present rather than dwelling on the past. Sometimes young people would come to the clinic and notice the medals. They would ask Sarah about her time in the Army, and she would tell them simply that military service had taught her the importance of helping others. She never talked about the battles or the awards, preferring to let her current actions speak for themselves. Sarah's story spread quietly through the veteran community and eventually reached the news media. Reporters wanted to interview the small town hero who had earned 5 Purple Hearts, but Sarah declined most requests. She believed the real heroes were the soldiers who never made it home, and she did not want attention that should go to their families. Today, more than 15 years after her retirement, Sarah continues to run her clinic and help people in her community. She has trained dozens of young medics and doctors, passing on not just medical knowledge but also the values of service and compassion that guided her military career. The woman who once appeared too small and gentle for military service had become one of the most decorated soldiers of her generation. But more importantly, she had proven that true heroism comes not from being the biggest or strongest, but from having the courage to help others when they need it most.